it will be about the, Great White Hoax is a really, easy title, because that's a lot, it covers a lot of ground. It can be about anything. And the stuff about white identity politics will certainly be part of what I'm going to talk about and what I'm going to have us talk about. So it'll be close. I'm telling you that because there are evaluation forms up here, and when we're done and you grab one, I don't want you to write on there, you can stick to the program, because I already warned you, it's not really exactly the program, so my honesty should get me some extra eval points. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm going to start this a little differently than I did yesterday. So if for some reason you did come to that one and you came back, even though you knew it was the same thing, which is weird, but thank you anyway, it's going to be different. So you're lucky, I guess, that you won't hear the exact same thing. But I was thinking about how I wanted to get into this discussion about white identity politics on campus and around the country, and the growth of really white backlash, reactionary nationalism, really. And I thought, how can I sort of connect this to another talk that I've been doing around the country for the last several months? Because for the last several months, I've been doing a lot of work around issues of historical memory and how we understand the past and its relationship to the present, and the critical nature of understanding the past as a way to understand what we're seeing in the present. And then I realized, well, actually, the rise of white identity politics and nationalism fits very well within that sort of paradigm. So I'm gonna start in the place where I've been starting a lot of my lectures lately, and then sort of ease into the thing that's in the program, and see if this works. So we'll see. So the thing about historical memory that I started thinking about wasn't so much as an activist or as a scholar or a writer or any of that, right? Or even as an educator. I started thinking about the importance of it in regard to issues of race, principally as a parent. Because as a parent, right, you're constantly sort of observing the way that your children come to understand the world. And my wife and I have two daughters. They'll be 15 and 13 in July, so pray for me. And but they're really great kids, actually, so it's probably going to all work out. They'll be 15 and 13. And a couple years ago, when they were, 12 and 10 or whatever, I think 12 and a half and 10 and a half, as the kids like to say to make themselves sound a little older. We were in the car one day. Our girls are dancers, both of them, and they were dancing in the same dance company at the time, and it's about an 8-minute drive from their school. So one day after school, I'm driving them to dance, and to get from the school to the dance studio, we live in Nashville, and the studio's downtown, and we're about 8 minutes away is where the school is from downtown. So we're driving on the surface streets, we're halfway there, and we're stopped at a red light. And the red light is right in the middle of a public housing community. Right, on both sides, public housing apartments. And we've made this drive, I don't know, for a year now, 5 days a week, roughly. So my kids have seen the neighborhood, we've driven through the neighborhood, we're stopped at the light that day for the first time. The youngest of our two daughters, Rachel, who was 10 and a half at the time, looks around and she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" I sat there and I thought in that brief second, that is a brilliant sociological question, and a really important anthropological question, a very scholarly inquiry, this 10 and a half. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, I got about 3 minutes before we get to the studio. I'm going to figure out if I can break this down, right? And before I begin to answer the question, I don't know if you have older siblings, but I was an only child, so I didn't know that this shit happens, but here's what happens. When the younger kid asks a question, the older kid will inevitably think they know the answer and will want to show off in front of the parent. So the older child, or maybe this is just my kids, I don't know, Ashton, the older of the two daughters, doesn't even let me answer the question, right? I'm ready. I've got my 3-minute version of, residential segregation 101. I'm ready. But Ashton jumps in immediately to show off, and she says, redlining, which is scary accurate. Frighteningly accurate for a 12-year-old to have come up. I don't know that I've ever actually talked to her about redlining, and if you don't know the term, I'll make sure you do in just a second, right? Maybe I mumble this in my sleep. Maybe there's an awareness gene for white supremacy that my daughter inherited. It's like cell memory, redlining, I think, is what that is. So the 10-year-old says, "No, I don't know what that means." And I said, "Yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off." But it was a good guess. For those who don't know, right, redlining is the practice. It was very open and very legal for years. Really, it was legal until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Basically, it was a practice whereby banks and other lending institutions, but principally, banks, commercial banks, would draw red lines literally on maps in loan offices, and anybody who lived within the neighborhood that was within the confines of the red line, and they were usually always black neighborhoods, occasionally Puerto Rican neighborhoods, every now and then they might be poor white neighborhoods, but it was very rare. It was mostly black neighborhoods. Anyone who lived within the boundaries of the line was not going to be able to get a loan for anything. Not for a house, not for a business, not for repairs to a home, nothing. And that didn't matter whether your credit was good. It didn't matter what your job was, what your education was, your income, any of that. It just mattered that you lived in that area. So that was one of the ways that those communities, including this particular community in the city of Nashville that was a public housing community, became not only concentrated racially, but also economically concentrated as a low-income space, because the people who lived there were not able to access capital. And then I explained the part that my daughter didn't understand, apparently, but I wanted her to know, and both of them to know, was that it wasn't just what was done to the black folks who lived in that community, it was also the fact that white folks who had lived in that community, because remember, public housing was created for poor white people, not for people of color. In the 1930s, people of color were routinely not even allowed to be in public housing. It was all poor whites. But then the government also created other programs for poor and working class whites, which allowed them to get out of the city, to leave public housing, to move to the suburbs, right, to get FHA loans and VA loans and later GI Bill benefits that were off limits to people of color in the vast majority of cases. So white folks are basically being subsidized to get out of the city and build this middle class that had not existed prior to these government programs, right, that were for whites only for the most part. And black folks are being kept in virtual concentration camp fashion into communities where they are unable to leave and where they're not able to access capital if they stay. So I give them that, and now we're at the studio, and we're out of time, right? But that was the 3-minute version. In other words, what I'm trying to explain to my daughters, and what I thought was important for them to know, is that you can't understand anything you see in 2016, or this was 2014 or whatever. You can't understand what you see in the present if you don't understand the historical precedents that came before it, right? So if you don't learn anything else from our conversation today, that would be pitiful, and I'm going to try to make sure you learn more. But if you learn nothing else, learn this. There are no accidents. There are only precedents, right? No accidents, only precedents, only things that precede that which we see. And if I understand all the stuff that went down that kept neighborhoods looking the way they look, then I have a better understanding of everything from wealth disparities in the modern era,